Welcome to Unquestionable. I am Dan Wu. You're listening to KZSE Santa Cruz. As a non-commercial educational radio station, KZSE supports free expression of ideas. Please be aware that the opinions expressed are those of the speakers or artists only and do not necessarily reflect the views of the UC Regents, KZSE staff, management, or underwriters. We welcome your feedback on our programming. Please direct your comments to the Program Review Committee at 831-459-4036 or by email at prc@kzse.org. You are listening to the show Unquestionable. I'm Dan Wu. On the line, we have our guest for today, Bryan Bird. He is the Southwest Program Director of the Defenders of Wildlife Group, and we're going to be talking border walls. Well, let's get right to it. Good afternoon, Mr. Bird. How you doing?
Hello, Dan. Thanks for having me with you today.
Now, you are the Southwest Program Director at the Defenders of Wildlife, correct?
That's right. I handle all of Defender's work in Texas, New Mexico, Arizona, and a sliver of Southern California.
Getting right into the most general overview of it, why is it that we came in contact and I was told by someone, hey, this is someone you might want to have on your show, and you're now on the air talking to people in the Monterey Bay area? Also, we have a lot of people that have moved away and liked our station and they listen online, so they might be in some of those areas, Southern California, Texas, Arizona, New Mexico, that you're talking about. What specifically is the push to get out on the media right now for Defenders of Wildlife, specifically with your field being the Southwest protection of animals and plants and other elements of the environment down there?
Well, what's really critical and happening right this very minute is Congresswoman Nancy Pelosi is negotiating how much money Congress will give this administration, the Trump administration, to continue to build these impenetrable barriers along our southern border. So as you all know, Trump administration made this sort of a huge campaign promise, although I think we all know now Mexico is not paying for it, and we are being asked to pay for it out of our tax dollars, out of our hard-earned money. So as we speak, in fact, tomorrow in particular, Congresswoman Pelosi is going to sit down with the president and the leader of the Senate, Chuck Schumer from New York State. And so Californians actually have a chance to talk to people in the Bay Area especially have a chance to talk to their congresswoman, who's a very powerful person. And she's got her fingers on the purse strings right now and on your tax dollars.
Is that going to be different in January, or are the negotiations ongoing right now already preparing for a Democratic House of Representatives? And how does that affect things, since the Senate is still controlled by Republicans as far as budgeting?
Yeah, well, good questions. Sadly, the happy story is that, the Congress did go to Democratic leadership. So in January, we will have a new Congress that will be led by the Democrats. It will be led by Nancy Pelosi. So in January, we will have a very real chance that we can shut down any new border walls and new border wall construction and new militarization of the border. But in the meantime, until then, we've got 2 weeks left with this Congress. And sadly, both the House and the Senate have promised to give Trump billions of dollars. On the House side, they promised $5 billion. On the Senate side, they promised about $1.6 billion for new border wall construction and militarization. So they've got 2 weeks left to negotiate in what's called Homeland Security appropriations. How much money are they going to give this administration? How much more money, I should say, because they have already given this administration billions of dollars. The question is, are they going to give them any more? Even after they won resoundingly in this last election, they are negotiating right now. And so we have a chance to stop it. We hope they'll give zero new dollars to this president for border militarization.
Can you tell me a little bit about the specific animals that you're trying to bring attention to as well, ones that migrate across the border back and forth? Because before we put a national border in any place on Earth, animals didn't have to pay attention to that. They more went where the climate suited their evolutionary needs. So a lot of animals find it to be the same place in Tijuana or San Diego or El Paso and Juarez, Mexico. Can you tell me about some of the species and how much at risk they are already? And then maybe also in terms of a border wall being put up.
Well, you bring up a lot of good points. So Defenders of Wildlife has been fighting the border wall since about 2005, when the first impenetrable border walls were being constructed. And there's about, nearly 1,500 different species that the border itself runs right through their habitat and their range. So there's a lot of these animals that go back and forth across the border looking for food, for mates, for water, all those types of things. And they've always done so, as have humans, to be honest. But this border is an artificial construct which may stop that. And so some of the more charismatic and interesting animals that Defenders of Wildlife is working to protect that cross the border are animals like the jaguar, the Mexican gray wolf, the bighorn sheep, the pronghorn antelope, the checker spot butterfly. Some of these animals, they may fly, but they don't fly very high off the ground. So those are just some of the more charismatic ones that we are directly trying to save. And I think you alluded to, and rightly so, the fact that this part of the world, the Southwest, Southern California and Arizona, New Mexico, and Texas, is going to be ground zero for the effects of climate change. We already know from all the research and studies that it's going to probably feel climate change first. It already is, frankly. And it's going to be especially severe in these areas because they're already dry and they're already pretty hot. So any animals that do live there may need to migrate. Due to climate change, they may need to shift their range north or, in fact, one of the more interesting animals that would happen to is Mexican gray wolf, which does live in Mexico right now, but will probably have to shift its range north to follow its prey species. But if there's a border wall, an impenetrable fence of any type, wall, fence, any kind of impenetrable border, that's it for those animals. They don't get to move across the border anymore.
Well,
and they're lost. Yeah, go ahead.
One thing, just a technical thing, I don't know, sometimes if I move 5 feet, my phone sounds better. I just want to make sure I give you the best quality. Maybe we could just experiment with that. But in that sense of an impenetrable border wall, I have two questions. One, when Michael Chertoff and his crew were going through the plans 13 years ago, and I've read some reports on that, they talked about putting holes in the wall to let smaller animals through, is what they said. Now, it seems like once you start putting holes in the wall to let smaller animals through, how big can that hole be before it's not even a barrier for humans or anything to get through? And which animals would that cut out? And also, the term charismatic animals always makes me think of how we try to save the cute animals and we eat tuna. Can you speak to that, those 2 points?
Yeah, they're good points. Putting a hole in the wall is sort of a ridiculous solution. There's many of the animals that need to cross are too large to get through anything. In other words, if they get through, a person gets through. So I think really the answer is we don't want to see anything impenetrable along our border. And I think it's kind of a non-starter to even talk about these holes that some smaller wildlife might be able to get through. But as you point out, it's not just the jaguars and the wolves that we're concerned about. There are all kinds of animals that deserve to be able to move through their natural habitat. And for example, the border wall has resulted in terrible flooding in certain places, especially in Arizona. There was some flooding a few years ago that actually resulted in human deaths, but also in resulted in wildlife being stuck and against the wall and drowned. They don't have the same ability. Some of these animals, like for instance, tortoises, were found to be, after the floods retreated, to be just hundreds of them were found dead after these floods. So, there's all kinds of impacts. These walls are basically like giant levees along any kind of river. So in the lower Rio Grande Valley of Texas, where the Rio Grande flows right along the border, it is the border in Texas, you have these giant levees that are going to redirect flooding and could be, will be treacherous to anything that's living along the river.
Now, we have 600 miles or so of wall already. And what effects have those been seen to create up to this point as a good precedent of maybe what we're looking for in things to avoid with a 2,000-mile barrier or reasons to avoid a 2,000-mile barrier?
Well, I think a really interesting example is there's a bighorn sheep that lives in Southern California and crosses the border into Baja California specifically for birthing of its young. It goes over there because there's water sources across the border in Mexico that it goes to. This bighorn sheep, it's called the peninsular bighorn sheep. It's actually a listed species under the Endangered Species Act. But, for example, when that wall is constructed, these sheep can't cross the border to, have their young and find the water resource. And the other example I gave earlier in Texas, where when the flood happened, all of these animals were found dead afterwards because they couldn't escape the flood. They couldn't get to higher ground. This giant impenetrable wall was in their way. So we've already seen the effects this has on wildlife. It's just that now the Trump administration wants to put more barrier in places that it isn't existing already. And that's, a lot of that country, it happens to be the most wild, natural country left along the borderlands, where a lot of our wildlife has been sort of driven into those places by other human development. So, the last remaining areas that are open are critical for wildlife to get across.
Now, there's a site called Center for Immigration Studies that I came across while researching this issue, and they're by no means trying to be unbiased. I don't believe any human can be unbiased, and I'll have to explain this show when I apply for more straight journalism jobs. But they have an article up from October 18th. It's an op-ed, of course. Mm-hmm. I'm sure probably most of the stuff on this site is op-eds. It's the Center for Immigration Studies is the name of their site, and their slogan is low immigration, pro-immigrant. And one of the most recognizable faces on there is Michelle Malkin of Fox News, a very, very biased, let's say, commentator for Fox News and other more right-wing sites. But they are calling out the Sierra Group specifically, and I would assume probably if you guys had a bigger profile, they would also have included you. You can correct me if that's wrong, but that in the past, they're claiming that Sierra, and it's true, especially if you go further back in the history, that immigration was an issue talked about in environmental groups in the past because more humans being here causes more environmental impact. And that they're claiming that now, because the Sierra Club wants funding from more Democratic Party linked groups and other parts of coalitions that are pro immigration, that they've dropped any opposition to immigration. And can you speak to whether there's any truth of immigration and environmental impact that would actually be helped by keeping people out?
Well, our mission is pretty narrow, and it's about wildlife, and we do not take positions on the immigration issue, and we haven't ever, whereas I don't know the history of the Sierra Club, and I'd hate to try to speak for them. All I mean is that just as how in the suffragette movement, they wanted to narrow their focus too, so sometimes other issues got worsened by that. Is there anything that you see being helped environmentally, I guess, by a border wall being built? No, I don't think so. I mean, I can't really, again, we don't address the immigration issue, but I will say this. One thing that this issue has done is really put a lot of organizations into cross-sectional work where, we do now reach out and work with many of the immigration rights groups, the human rights groups, the communities that live down there along the border. Defenders of Wildlife, again, has a very narrow mission. It's really protecting imperiled species, however they're threatened. And yes, obviously, population growth and consumption of resources is a issue that all of us should be concerned with. But, as far as the wildlife goes, it's our area of expertise. But it's been interesting to see sort of the cross-sectional work, because we are now working with some of these organizations and that are pro-immigration, or at least that are at least human rights oriented, and ensuring that people are not dying trying to find refuge from whatever it is that they're fleeing. So it's created, really, I would say, a stronger and more powerful resistance to what this administration is trying to do, especially along the border, that might not have really existed before that.
Yeah, and I guess that's the point, is that they're actually calling them out for ceasing to make statements on immigration, as you're saying, kind of not trying to mix that in. But by doing that, then you end up sometimes making an alliance with people, because you're no longer, by not taking a position on it, you're able to talk with them, I guess, about it. But also going back to some of there's a Texas School of Law report I found, and it's actually addressing the George W. Bush administration's attempts to make a border wall. But I think it's still very relevant, especially since there haven't really been new environmental impact statements on this new one in any long-term way yet. And so they're looking at the lack of environmental impact statements back then in 2008. And they write in their introduction, the United States government asserts that construction of the border wall between Texas and Mexico would affect wildlife and aquatic resources by conferring only short and long-term negligible to moderate adverse impacts. And then the writers of the report go on to say that it's inaccurate and imaginary, and they're very... For being academics, they're very, very bold in their statement. They said, in contrast, the data relied on to formulate the government's conclusion of negligible to moderate adverse and minor beneficial impacts is almost non-existent. And that's between Texas and Mexico, where supposedly the support for this wall would be the strongest if you look at the voting totals. So can you speak to what's already been learned on past attempts with this, when we have done some environmental impact statements? Can you talk about what we've learned from past environmental impact statements done by the government?
Well, I don't think anybody's really looked at the impacts, especially since we've now constructed wall. Nobody's done kind of the before and after work, which is really critical to any good, quote-unquote, monitoring or scientific monitoring of the effects of something like this. They might have said, oh, well, it won't have any effects before they built it, but where is the data now? We're a long way off from when George Bush was building walls. Where's the data to show that this didn't harm, some of the populations that have just a small number of animals on one side of the wall that need to interact with the larger amount of animals on the other side of the wall. So, you can measure that type of stuff. It's very simple to do. They haven't done it. But I think this brings up really what I think is one of the bigger issues that I don't know that everybody understands, that there is a law that Congress passed, and unfortunately George Bush signed, that allows the administration to waive any federal and state law. In other words, to ignore any federal and state law as it plans and builds these border walls and frankly, any of the border militarization activities they're undertaking. This really should worry and scare everybody, because why is it that the people that live down there along the border don't enjoy the same protections in our laws that we enjoy, 200 miles away from the border, or for that matter, in Santa Cruz. I think we, Defenders of Wildlife, along with a couple of other organizations, have challenged this waiving of laws under the Constitution. We think it's unconstitutional that the administrative branch, the president, basically has the authority to just say these laws, any law, don't apply here. That should scare everybody. And they're using it. President Trump has used it 5 times since he's been president to clear the way for his border wall.
Recently, Ryan Zinke was down at the border. He's the Interior Secretary, one of the more survival adapted cabinet members in our government. He's been able to adapt and survive through a year and a half, almost 2 years as Interior Secretary. And he was down there recently. Well, no, this was a little while ago. Mm-hmm. But he said that the public lands that are there, not just the ranches that are bordering that also don't want the wall on their property, said that the wall will go through all of the public lands that he oversees. At the end, the best he could say to reporters was, clearly we're going to build a wall. Clearly the design is not yet finished. Those two seem to at least partially contradict each other, because if it hasn't been designed yet, then it's not clear that they're going to build a wall. And my question there is, was this just something that's never going to really happen, and it was put out there to get votes from people that think they care about this issue more? And if that's true, is this distracting from work that you guys could be doing in other areas?
Well, no doubt that this is a polarizing issue, and it's one that the president and his cabinet sees in their helping them. But the fact of the matter is, a CBS poll last month showed 89% of Democrats are against it, obviously, and 62% of independents oppose it. So it's not clear that it's popular, but it does go to his core constituency. And so they are using it as a political pawn. But I will say, no doubt, they are already constructing wall, and they are going to construct more wall. So it is a reality. It is happening right now. They've got the money already to construct more wall. Now they're asking Congress right this second to give them even more money. So, the fact of the matter is, it is being constructed as we speak. More is going to be constructed and it affects animals that Defenders of Wildlife works to protect. It's in our mission. We have other regions where we work in the field. I mean, we have a California office, we have an Alaska office. I work in the Southwest, so that puts me right in basically ground zero for this particular issue, and it affects many of the species we've worked on for a long time, as I mentioned earlier, like the jaguar, the ocelot, the Mexican gray wolf. These are species Defenders has worked on for 25, 30 years before the wall was real. So, I think it's not necessarily distracting us from other work, but we are putting a lot of resources into it because we think it's important.
I'm speaking with Bryan Bird, the Southwest Program Director of the Defenders of Wildlife, and we are talking about the possible environmental impacts of a border wall being constructed, which I personally don't think is going to happen. I think it's something imaginary that he put out for people to vote for him. But as an organization that protects the environment, you do have to take it seriously, because if they do build it and I'm wrong, then it would be negligence for you guys not to have worked on this. And I mentioned Ryan Zinke, the Interior Secretary, but Scott Pruitt stepped down as the EPA head, and now there's an acting EPA head. And how does that affect your guys' work when there's not really someone running that agency? And despite the person at the top, are there still people within that industry in that agency that have been helpful to your cause and that maybe agree with you?
Absolutely. The challenge now is that this administration has said they will not turn over any information under the Freedom of Information Act. I mean, they will not turn over information without using the Freedom of Information Act. So every bit of information we want now has to go through an official request, and it takes time, and sometimes we have to actually litigate that to get it. But having said that, yes, there are people within the Department of Interior, especially within the Fish and Wildlife Service, that are really concerned. And they're making their concerns known internally, but the Department of Interior under Zinke has been quashing that, has been saying to them, you can't talk publicly about this. You can't talk about the impacts. And so you're seeing political interference, and these people can't do their jobs, and the truth can't come out unless there's groups like Defenders and others that are doing these Freedom of Information Act requests.
Now I'm actually reading Seymour Hersh, a great investigative journalist's autobiography, and he's talking about all the leaks coming out of the Nixon administration when he was a young reporter. And we hear all the leaks coming out of all these departments in the Trump administration. How do you guys feel about leaks? Are they coming through from the EPA? Are they helpful to you? Do you think the precedent of leaks is a problem for the public in any way? Have you been getting leaked information that helps you?
Yeah. Yes. And yes, I think it is important, and it is, especially in an administration like this, where secrecy is such a huge part of the agenda. But having said that, in this particular situation with the border, it doesn't matter because they have this authority to waive every single law, state and federal. So in other words, even if employees of the Fish and Wildlife Service were telling us this will be the end of the ocelot, it's not going to matter because the Endangered Species Act doesn't apply. It's been waived. It's just, it's really alarming, in my opinion, that this law is on the books, and that a president can waive any law he or she wants in this situation. What if they start applying that to the northern border, to Canada, and saying, no laws apply up here either? It's a pretty chilling thought.
I remember the first time I ever encountered a law like that was when Silvio Berlusconi very publicly passed one in Italy while he was president. It put on the books in concrete language that the president could never be charged for any basically if the president does it, it is legal. And places like Turkey do that. And we now look and we joke about how, we miss George W. Bush because, God, he was horrible then, but look what we have now. But this law, you're saying, that exempts them from any laws, including the environmental impact studies, endangered species, property rights of owners, which should bother some Republican
Native American burial laws,
and it should bother some conservative landowners too, and it does bother them that those laws are exempted, because there's a lot of Texas ranches that have existed from like the 1700s, and the border wall would actually have to be built on their property in such ways that put the wall north of the border and north of their property line. So they'd have like a weird middle chunk. And so, but my point is that law being put in by George W. Bush should really like cement in that like this has been a horrible problem for longer than we think, and that we shouldn't act like this is out of the blue because Trump is such a horrible anomaly, but that our government has actually been trying to do things outside of normal law and order for a while, correct?
That's a good point, and I'm not going to disagree with it.
How do we get that law removed? Can we do it with only a House of Representatives of Democrats? And are they willing to do it? Because honestly, I think there's a lot of cool things that the Democrats should do all the time. And they are maybe more pro-business and pro-industry and pro-military more than me. And so it's a non-starter.
Absolutely. And it does take, Congress can do it, but it does take the signature of the president. So I have to say that it would probably be a fruitless, endeavor until this president is gone and we have somebody that really believes in the Constitution again. At this point, you're right. It goes back several administrations, and it's, in my mind, it's a slippery slope and a scary one. Defenders of Wildlife, we challenged it all the way up to the Supreme Court in 2007 when, the first time it was used. And we were rebuffed by the Supreme Court. Even in 2007, they said, no, we don't want to hear it. Meaning they rejected our petition. We have petitioned again in this administration with another waiver. We lost it in California. We challenged where he applied it. The Secretary of Homeland Security applied it in California. We challenged it. We lost in California. and we petitioned to the Supreme Court, because this law also says that you don't get to appeal to the appeals court. You don't get the normal legal proceeding. It has to go straight to the Supreme Court. So you have no recourse at the appeals court. So we had to go to the Supreme Court, and they just 2 weeks ago declined to hear the case again. So, we got a problem in the Supreme Court, too.
Now, when the House of Representatives was held by the Republicans, they chose to hold a lot of symbolic votes on issues such as health care that they knew weren't going to be signed by the president, Barack Obama at the time. And they used their time to do that. So they didn't really get a lot done, but they got to tell their voters, hey, we voted to take away this law 35 times. We just couldn't do it because the president wouldn't sign it. Now, do you think that the Democrats should do something like that with this issue? Or are there little bits that they could maybe sneak through that would help your cause in the meantime that would actually get signed by the president, maybe because he doesn't know what he's signing?
Yes. Yes. Right now, as they, our representatives and senators, are negotiating the appropriations bills that they want the president to sign before the end of the year, they could slip in very small pieces of language that would say they have to do the environmental study, or they can't use the 2005 Real ID Act on new border wall and militarization. So, yes, there are ways to do that. But I think right now the most important message that Nancy Pelosi needs to hear is that we don't want a single penny more for border wall construction in this Congress. And not just that. For those of you that follow this stuff even more closely, they're talking about what's called a continuing resolution, which means they don't have to deal with the issue before the end of the year, but they're talking about doing it for a year with a special provision that would include $5 billion more for border wall next year. It's cockamamie, but they can do it. And so we're trying to let the leadership, Nancy Pelosi especially, know that we don't want any money in any continuing resolution or appropriations bill, period, for border wall.
Would you support a stonewalling maneuver strong enough to shut down the government to stop this funding? And would that hurt you with allies of Defenders of Wildlife or bother you as an individual? Because when the government shuts down, a lot of, I would say, innocent bystanders maybe lose their paycheck for a few weeks. Among other things, among worse, like emergency services aren't funded properly and on and on and on. Sure.
I think there is a very serious danger in any kind of shutdown, and we don't want to see it because of all the things you just mentioned. But this issue is hugely important, I think, for everybody in the country. I mean, it's not just the people that live along the border. I mean, this is, it really is. I know you say it has gone back a few administrations, and that's true. But this guy's really pushing it hard at this point in time, and I think it's got so many different wrinkles in it, from the impacts to wildlife to the impacts on communities to the impacts on families who have moved back and forth across the border for generations, to whether or not the Constitution applies. I think these are issues that everybody needs to worry about. And I think one thing you made me think about earlier is that not a lot of people understand that the 2005 Real ID Act allows the presidential administration to waive any law. I don't think enough people understand that, and so I think it's part of Defender's job to ensure people are hearing about this. Because I think even people in Santa Cruz or people in, Arcata and north, all the way to the border need to hear this.
Absolutely. And thank you so much. This has been an interview with the Southwest Program Director of the Defenders of Wildlife, Bryan Bird. Any 30 seconds or a minute to get any last words in about where people can get more information on this, or how they can get involved with your group or other groups working on fighting a border wall on environmental grounds?
Absolutely. Thanks for asking. We have a website. It's defenders.org, and all of our contact is on there, including our California office in Sacramento. We do a lot of work there, and we do need as many people to help us on this particular issue, among many others. So, get in touch with us and get engaged. And this is probably one of the better times to get in touch with Nancy Pelosi if you are so inclined.
Oh, wait, I have one last question for you. Thank you for staying late, too. I was just enjoying this interview, and the leadership of Nancy Pelosi, I have problems with her. Like I said, she falls definitely more on the more capitalistic industry side of a lot of things than I do. And she's also very, very old now. And that would be a knock on anyone, male or female, that is of long after retirement age that is still in office. And where do you guys look at the next generation of leadership in the next few years, given that no human lives forever?
Well, I think
so that we don't have a vacuum of leadership later on, I guess.
Right. Well, it's pretty exciting to see a lot of new young voices going into Congress with this election. So I think we've got a real chance now, probably, in my opinion, personally, it seems better than ever to affect some of these changes that will bring our democracy into, full action.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Bryan Bird, Southwest Program Director of the Defenders of Wildlife.
Thanks, Dan. It was great talking with you.
Have a great day, man. And I will be posting this interview online at various venues. We got a little homebrew with the track Mirrors right now. My apologies to anyone trying to text in with questions about that issue with Bryan Bird. We were having issues with our landline to studio computer hookup here, but we have 18 minutes left. I'm going to take a quick break, come back with an announcement or two, and then I will take your questions and comments on the issue of a border wall, and preferably in its relation to environmental issues. Those can be affecting humans, though. I'm not going to say only animals, because we're animals too. And the economy and everything that we do is all an illusion, and the birds and squirrels are wondering why we're in such a hurry.
Judgment when you're first starting to live all on your own. No, you're not alone. You're just not leaning on the wall. I am a skunk repelling everything I find, searching, not finding any shred of peace of mind. Is it courage to boldly admit to all I lack? Imagine phantom father is never coming back. Break all the mirrors, don't be afraid of bad news, 'cause it's the only kind we have here. Break all the mirrors, don't be afraid of bad luck, 'cause it's the only kind we have here. Are you better than me? 'Cause I'm no better than you. Are you better than me? 'Cause I'm no better, no better. I play my hand conservatively, 'cause a deck ain't in my favor. Yeah, pawn the good ones for later. I don't have a plan, just a side of...
Speaking of feedback, you can call in to 831-459-4036 with your comments and questions about that last interview with Bryan Bird, Southwest Program Director for the Defenders of Wildlife. As you're listening to Unquestionable, this is Dan Wu. I just spoke with Bryan Bird, the Southwest Program Director for the group Defenders of Wildlife, who are opposing the new push for a border wall along the southern border of Texas, New Mexico, Arizona, and California, put forth by the Trump administration and previously by the George W. Bush administration. It's Unquestionable, Dan Wu, KZSE Santa Cruz. Let this song burn itself out.